This course will examine audit planning, and together with the next course in this path, where we will examine the execution of an audit, this counts for 18% of the CISA certification examination. This course examines the process and general knowledge required to perform audits. In later domains, we will look further into how to audit specific parts of IT management, IT systems, and data protection. There are three important areas that are covered in this course. We will start with reviewing audit standards and the various types of audits and assessments we may conduct. Then, we will learn how to plan an audit, scheduling, and with a focus on risk-based auditing. We protect information and information systems through the use of controls, various types and layers of controls that provide a control fabric that might either prevent problems through the use of safeguards or react effectively to security incidents through the use of countermeasures. These controls are justified based on risk, and as auditors, we need to know how to assess the effectiveness and adequacy of these controls as a comprehensive control fabric that is used to protect the information systems that support business processes and ultimately the business mission. We will conduct this course and conclude it with a domain summary of the important areas that were addressed in this course, and throughout the course we will frequently stop to review key areas and topics that are essential for exam success. Let's get started with our first module in this course, Audit Standards. Let's take a look at this CISA program, starting out by looking at the information systems auditing process and in particular, well, what is audit? Audit standards, for example. We'll do an overview first of really what auditing is, and we have a good definition I kind of like here, that auditing is where we give business owners, lenders, government agencies fair assessments of a company's financial records, business processes, and accounting procedures. In our case, we are looking at information systems auditing, so we're going to look more at things like business processes and the systems that support those processes, and we're going to look at financial records from whether or not the data we are providing from our information systems is accurate for those financial records or accounting procedures. Well, what is audit? Audit has many different names. For example, to audit is to inspect, to examine, survey, scrutinize, probe, investigate, assess, appraise, and evaluate. We can say in all of these, what we are doing is we're taking something and we're dissecting it, we're looking into it, we're really seeing how this process works. Is it working correctly? But of course, one of the great things about audit is the opportunity for improvement as well. There are two main types of audit that we deal with: internal auditing and external auditing. They both have their place, and they certainly both have their purposes. If we take a look, for example, at an internal audit is made up of people that are from within the company that really, they know the business, they know the people, they know the processes. Sometimes we say they know where the skeletons are hidden in the closet, for example. They understand what the main business goal is, and they also understand the relationships between different systems and departments and those dependencies. In many cases, internal audit is set up to address management's concerns. They look specifically at things that management indicates are, could you take a look at this and just see if this is working well? I had this, for example, where the head of IT came to me and said, I would just like a review of whether or not I'm getting value for the investment I'm making in IT products. So great, we address specifically a concern of that manager. Now, external audit is usually done according to very formal standards and trying to meet with things like compliance, and can often be a little bit more objective because they're not part of the internal team. They very often create audits that are comparable between different organizations and are seen very often as authoritative and credible because they're independent of the organization they're actually reviewing. Quite often, external auditors are made up of an organization that has a wider range of different skill sets, specialists in financial and forensics auditing and process auditing and specialists in websites and other forms of IT, for example. So why do we have internal audit? The objective of an internal audit group is to, well, ensure compliance. Compliance with things like the laws that the organization is subject to good practices and good standards, as well as compliance with policy. If the organization has certain policies, quite often internal audit are the review to provide assurance that those policies are correct and are being followed. In this way, internal audit has often been described as the eyes and ears of management. They provide insight for management into better efficiencies, return on investment, and the maturity, dependability of our various systems and processes. Now, when we look at external audit, we are often looking at the area of compliance. Compliance with generally accepted accounting practices, for example, and financial statements with things like SOX, for example. Good accounting, good compliance with laws and regulations, as well as we could use an external audit to ensure that we're compliant with various standards, such as an ISO 27001 certification audit. Would always have to be done by an external group to be credible and authoritative. Quite often, we are going to look into things such as quality, 9001, security, 27001, as ways to indicate whether or not our organization is following recognized good or best practice, whatever term you like to use. In many ways, external audit provides a report that allows external people, such as shareholders and regulators, to get a glimpse into whether or not this organization is being run in a good way. In that way, it provides insight, both for management to know what they should do, but also for the confidence or assurance of outside organizations as well. So what makes a good auditor? To be a really good auditor and become a CISA professional, it is important that we have attention to detail. We're thorough in what we do. We also should be curious. We want to turn over the rocks. We want to dig into something. We saw before, to inspect, to examine, to appraise, for example. We also need to be completely honest, and that means we must follow good practices in everything from ethics to how we report on anything we find. We should be good at communicating. If we're internal, we need to communicate with the various business departments and management. And as external, we provide reports that could be seen as credible and believable as well. We also need to be good at listening, because it's important here to hear what people say, but also what they don't say. So when we're doing an audit, we want to have our ears open and really sense, are there things here that could be improved, or things that are really going well, we should continue. We also need to have the powers of observation. When we saw these stories of Sherlock Holmes, we often saw that he would chide Dr. Watson a little bit. He says, you see, but you don't observe. A good auditor not only sees someone doing a job, but also is able to observe, is this job being done in the right way? Are there better ways to do it? So we have seeing together with analysis and assessment, and that is truly observation. Let's review some of the key points we've covered in this little section. Auditing is important. It's an important function to protect the interests of various, both internal and external stakeholders. Audit, especially internal audit, may be directed by management, or it could be an external audit that is required by regulation to ensure compliance and certainly good financial reporting. Let's take a look at the audit process. The audit process starts with planning out which audits I can do this year, as well as which maybe I will do in future years as part of the audit universe. Then, gathering evidence as I conduct the audit, analyzing that evidence that I've gathered, what we often call the audit work papers, and then creating the audit report. First of all, in a draft format for review, and then the final report, which is submitted according to the audit plan. We should also be prepared to do follow-ups where necessary to see if things have been fixed that maybe were found during the audit and where management had pledged to address them. Now, each of these areas is going to be examined in more detail as we progress through this course. So what is the first step in auditing? The first step in being able to conduct a good, meaningful value audit is really to understand the business. Understand what the business mission and objectives are so that when I perform the audit, it will have value and it will be lined up with those business values. For example, some restaurants want to serve food quickly and not necessarily great quality, but consistent. Whereas another restaurant wants a really good dining experience. When I'm going to audit either of those processes, it's a completely different management style, it's a completely different objective, and therefore I need to understand that business mission before I begin conducting the audit. I had an example where a company had paid for a penetration test of their website, and the problem was that the report that came from the pen testing company would have put their website out of business. Well, that, of course, is a failed audit. Certainly, you can say that the purpose of a good audit is to help support the business and not to put it out of business. We have to understand not just what the business says publicly its mission is, but what is the culture. Understand we can see here the overall true mission. Is it just to make money? Or is it to provide high quality? What is also this organization's risk appetite? Is this an organization that likes to be innovative, try new things, or something which is very careful and doesn't want to take too much risk? We need to audit according to that risk appetite, but also risk capacity. Maybe the organization is struggling to survive. I can't come with all kinds of expensive audit recommendations that again would mean the business can't even be profitable. We need to understand the regulatory world in which this business operates. Are there laws or regulations that apply, as well as what is their market? Is their market, for example, highly competitive, or is it something which is a little bit more stable where everybody has their own fixed areas or niche of business? In all of this, we see the culture. We see how the business perceives itself, how it sees itself within the greater competitive world, and how it treats its employees, for example. There are many different types of business. Therefore, I need to look at doing audit differently according to the type of business that we are dealing with. Are we a commercial for-profit business where everything in the end still has to be about making money and keeping our shareholders happy? Or are we military, where the main thing is the mission much more than, say, individual processes? Or are we law enforcement, where our goal is certainly for the dealing of public safety more than, for example, efficient IT operations? Are we government, where we are service-oriented and certainly have to respond to the wishes of the population that we support and serve? Or are we a not-for-profit, where we are trying to provide a service very often volunteer driven. So once I understand the type of business I'm in, that can help also change the way we approach the audit itself. There are many different types of audits we can do. We certainly are looking more at information systems auditing, but there are also financial audits, forensic audits when there's been some type of investigation, or of course compliance audits to ensure that we are compliant with laws or regulations. But one of the things we should always be aware of as we step into the world of audit is the area of audit risk. The thing is that there is the risk that the audit would not find something it should have found. We can say here the auditor did not discover a material or a significant issue during the performance of the audit. Now, there could be many reasons for this. It could be that there was some type of fraud that was there that was hard to find, or it could well be that the auditor themselves just wasn't looking as they should have, turning over the rocks and being curious, we can say. So there are many reasons why an audit might fail. For example, maybe the auditor was conducting the audit, doing some interviews, and was misled. They made some false assumptions. They thought they understood the process, but they didn't. Or it could be that the information they were given was wrong, maybe, of course, an outright lie or just incomplete evidence. It could be that they were given misleading statements from management. Management said, oh, yes, this is all good, but when we looked at it, that wasn't really the case. There also can be a reason for failing an audit because of a lack of skilled resources. No auditor is going to be able to conduct every type of audit today. We have so many different types of IT systems and even non-traditional IT that no one knows everything. And sometimes it could be a mistake that the auditor just didn't have the experience or skill they needed. It could be also that the reason the audit failed was they didn't get the support they needed. For example, we needed access to systems, or we needed access to buildings, or access to people, and that was denied. And because I couldn't see into that system, I couldn't really find or probe to see if there are any problems in how that system worked. Because I couldn't interview the right people, I only interviewed those that management appointed or selected that they knew would not be controversial. Maybe I really missed some of the things that were going on. We need to be aware of these things, because if I'm aware, then I can watch for, make sure I don't, of course, become a victim of delivering a failed audit. One of the areas that often can be difficult is when management says, well, here's the documentation, here's how this process works. And if as an auditor, I just look at that documentation and say, okay, this is the process, and I'm fine. But if I talk to the people, I find out that's not how they do it at all. And it could well be that the documentation was a theoretical, but certainly not a true or practical delivery. Quite often, that lack of skill can be addressed through things like using outside experts. For example, an outside expert can provide a level of expertise that I may not have. Also, that outside expert could have been a previous auditor who'd looked at this before and delivered a report that said, here are some things that I found, that I looked for, and there can be a great benefit by knowing what to look for, especially areas where improvement was warranted, but also there can be a risk of using a prior audit report. That risk could be that I become biased or misled. I don't look at some of the things that I should have looked at because I just thought they'd been looked at before. But the idea of having specialized skills is really helpful, because these people can bring maybe tools or knowledge that I don't have. But it's important that an audit is a very sensitive business process. We need to make sure that we don't find our sensitive information or our vulnerabilities or risk become publicly known. So therefore, we will often require an outside expert to sign some type of non-disclosure agreement to protect that the information they learn by examining our systems is not shared inappropriately. So what are some key points to review here? Audit should be methodical. It's a structured series of activities that are designed to meet the agreed on audit objectives, and auditing starts long before the first site visit through gathering documentation and gaining an appreciation of the business itself. Let's take a look at the specific area of the CISA, that is, a Certified Information Systems Auditor. So how do we audit an information system? Now, many people have come into this field because they were a financial auditor before, but now they are expanding to look at IT audit and IS audit, or people that were very technical before now need to learn how to audit those technologies they used to work on. So in many ways, we need to address two things. What is the process of audit? And of course, specifically, how to audit an information system. It is important to emphasize, first of all, that there's a large difference between an IT audit and an IS audit. IT is auditing of technology, whereas an information system itself is really about not only the technology, but how the technology is used within and to support the business. So what is an information system is the first thing we have to address. And then how do we examine an information system, which means we look at the people that use and administer the information system, the processes used for things like change management and systems development, and of course the technology itself. How is it properly configured and operating efficiently? So the first question, what is an information system? Information systems are the strategic, managerial, and operational activities involved in gathering, processing, storing, and distributing and using information and its related technologies. So therefore, we are going to look at an information systems audit in many different phases of a system's life cycle. We look at how it actually is first built and how is it designed to gather and collect information. How does it preserve the integrity and confidentiality of that information as it's processing and storing it? And of course, making sure that the data that comes out of the system that's distributed only goes to the right people and is correct, for example. And we can bring in, of course, those concepts of confidentiality, integrity, and availability as core tenets or pillars upon which our information system should operate. When we audit information systems, we first of all want to know, well, what is management concerned with? Management is often concerned with business more than they are with, say, hackers or something external. They are concerned with things like return on investment, that all of the capital and operational costs that go into IT and IS every year are actually providing a reasonable return for the support of the business. That means that we use the resources, both the people as well as the money and tools we have, effectively. We are compliant with laws and standards, for example, and we have managed the risk, which means we look at things such as what is the liability if our system doesn't work? Are there legal consequences? Are there financial risks involved? As well as, of course, reputational risk. What do our customers say if every time they call into our call center, we have to say, I'm sorry, our systems are down right now. We'll have to look into this and get back to you. We usually audit against a benchmark, so that instead of just auditing what we as auditors think are good things to look for, we actually use benchmarks that are already there. That means that the results of our audit are authoritative in the way that that same audit can be compared with what other companies or even other systems are doing. So some of those benchmarks we can use as auditors are standards. For example, you have the ISO 27001 that defines here are the good practices and requirements for an information security management system. A very good thing that we as auditors can use to make sure that everything is being done in a good way according to a recognized international standard. We could use something like the payment card industry. The payment card industry, put together by Visa, MasterCard, Discover, and JCB, put out the digital and data security standard that says this is what good payment card processing should look like. Here are the standards, as well as, of course, part of PCI. It says, and here's how to test for compliance with these. So we as auditors can use this so we can go to an organization and say, yes, we compared your practices with these external standards, and here we have found you are compliant, or maybe there's some areas we need to work on. But that gives authority because it's not just my opinion of what the organization should do. Instead, it's something that is recognized even by outsiders. We also quite often will audit according to laws. There are many different privacy laws we've seen in different places. For example, in Europe, you've got GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations, that requires certain behaviors in the way that I protect personal information and personally identifiable information. There are industry-specific laws. For example, in North America, we have the North American Electrical Reliability Corporation, which then ensures the distribution and generation of electrical power is according to certain standards. In the healthcare industry, you've got HIPAA, which deals with, of course, the protection of protected health information, or PHI. You have financial regulations, the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, and of course SOX, which many other countries have a copy of SOX as well. The Sarbanes-Oxley that says, can your financial reports be trusted? So these are some of the things that we use as the template, or you could call it the checklist, we can use to ensure that we're doing things in a good, reliable manner. So let's review this. Audit serves as management's insight. It provides eyes and ears so management can really see what's happening, not just what they're being told, but also, of course, to external stakeholders, people that are going to be owners or shareholders or our financial institutions providing backing, government, which is worried about regulations. Audit provides that insight those external parties need. But to be a good auditor, I have to have a level of humility that says I need to be aware that it's possible to make mistakes. I need to be aware of audit risk and take care to ensure that I don't fail to meet proper auditing standards and practices. As auditors, we are required to follow the mandatory standards for all audits that we conduct. For example, the auditor is expected and required to follow auditing standards whenever we conduct an audit to ensure that our audits meet the expectations of the stakeholders. These standards are based on the ISACA standards as listed on the ISACA webpage. We also can see a reference to these through the Institute of Internal Auditors at the IIA.org. The first is ethics. As auditors, we are required to be ethical in how we conduct ourselves at a customer premises during the audit and, of course, in the reporting of the audit. Now, the core principle of ethics has usually been do no harm. In other words, make sure that what I do does not cause unreasonable harm to anybody. The IS auditor ethics that are listed by ISACA say that we must always audit according to standards, not just personal bias or opinion. We should be objective in what we audit and not audit our own work or be a part of the process as being audited. As auditors, we should be lawful and of good character, and we must respect the privacy and confidentiality of the information we are able to see when we are conducting an audit. We should never audit something for which we don't have the required skill or competence, and we must maintain the correct level of competence for audits as well. We must report on any significant, or sometimes we see that word called any material issue. We should also use audits as a way to educate the stakeholders on, for example, risk and compliance and good practice. Audit standards list the mandatory requirements for conducting information systems audits as well. That requires a certain level of skill, proficiency, and of course, in the way we conduct the audit, the performance of the audit in a professional manner. It then lists the mandatory requirements for reporting and, of course, for ethics. There are three main types of audit standards. The first are the general standards that look at auditor ethics, independence, and skill. Then the performance standards that look at audit planning, supervision, and judgment. And then the standards on reporting, the types of reports, and of course the information that must be communicated while we report on the completion of an audit. We're going to look first of all at general standards, then look at the others, performance and reporting, later on. The first thing is that as an auditor, we must be independent of the area being reviewed. That means organizational independence. That is why auditors almost always have a dotted line that goes directly to the board of directors and the audit committee of the board, so that the auditors are not beholden to any senior manager and would be unable to properly audit if, for example, it was the department they were in that was maybe subject to an audit. Now, obviously, for payroll reasons and organizational hierarchy, internal audit is usually going to be located somewhere within the organization and reporting to a senior manager, but they must also have a way to bypass that senior manager because, as I can attest from my own experience, there's been several times when we had to audit, for example, and it was the manager above us that in the end actually there were some concerns with. We needed to be organizationally independent. Now, if it's an external auditor, that's a little bit more obvious in many cases, but even then we've seen cases where unfortunately the external auditors became too friendly with the management of the company they were auditing and were no longer objective and able to do their jobs properly. We must also be professionally independent. As audit professionals, we must be independent and objective in attitude, not biased in that way, but also in appearance, that people don't see us as being too friendly with the area that we are auditing. The next standard deals with a reasonable expectation. The auditor should reasonably expect that the audit can be completed according to good audit standards or practices. We will not be hindered in conducting the audit by, say, management. We should ensure that the scope of the audit enables the completion of the audit properly, so the area that we are auditing is completely within the scope of the audit, and everything within the scope, it has been reviewed. That management will provide relevant and timely information, and included in that also is access. So as auditors, we should reasonably be able to expect these three things. Also, when we conduct an audit, the auditor will provide due care in observing auditing standards in how we plan, perform, and report on the audit engagement. And this is then called due professional care because it's what is expected of us, not just as a member of an organization, but as a member of a professional organization. We also have standards regarding proficiency. The auditor will have adequate skills and be professionally competent to perform the required work of the audit. We shall know the subject matter, the area that we're auditing, and we must maintain professional competence, keep learning, for example, about new technologies and business processes and risk. Assertions, and this is a difficult one. Assertions, everything that I say or assert as part of audit findings and, of course, audit recommendations shall be sufficient, valid, and relevant, and capable of being re-audited. If somebody else came and took a look at my work, would they come to the same results or the same conclusion? And this is where we, as auditors, need to be really careful in how we then gather and analyze information to ensure we've not been misled or come out with an opinion that was based on half information, for example. And that should also be relevant to the organization. We also set criteria. The criteria against which the subject matter will be assessed should be objective, complete, relevant, measurable, understandable, widely recognized, authoritative, understood, and available. So what does this say? For example, if I'm going to do an IS audit, quite often I will base that on something like the ISO 27001. That is very much a widely recognized, authoritative, and available standard. And we use that so that people know what was the benchmark or what was the criteria used in this audit so that other auditors would actually hopefully come to the same conclusions as we did. We also need to consider the source of the criteria. Is this criteria we are using something which is authoritative and independent and objective, for example, and complete? The key points. Audits must be conducted following mandatory ethical and general standards. In the next module, we're going to examine some of the required performance and reporting standards that go together with these ethical and general standards we've just reviewed. Let's continue looking at the standards used when we do auditing. We looked at ethical standards and general standards. Now we are going to look at performance standards. Every audit should be planned in order to ensure that each audit meets certain objectives, has a scope, timelines, and meets its deliverables. We also want to ensure we address any applicable laws and audit standards that apply in this audit, and we use a risk-based audit approach so that we're able to audit the areas of higher risk as we plan our various audit engagements. We also have to do planning so that we're able to address any engagement-specific issues, such as, does the auditor working in this engagement need to have a higher level of clearance, such as secret or top secret? Are there rules for gaining access to the facility, for example? As well as, we want to have within each audit the documentation and reporting. Who gets a copy of the audit report, for example? In all of this, we document this audit engagement, this audit task, within the overall project plan. Using risk assessment and planning is important because we need to look at the areas that are of a higher priority and use our audit resources, which are often very limited, as effectively as we can. We need to assess the risk that's relevant to the area when we are actually planning out this audit engagement. And we must consider subject matter risk and audit risk, as well as the related exposure to the enterprise. What is the risk in this area we're auditing, but also what are the things that could cause this audit to fail and leading to audit risk where it didn't deliver what it was supposed to. We also have performance standards related to performance and supervision of the audit. When we are doing an audit, we should do it according to the audit plan and audit schedule and provide adequate supervision to audit staff. We should only accept tasks within our knowledge set. So I don't assign a task to a person who doesn't have the competence or skill to be able to conduct that audit in a meaningful way. We should always obtain sufficient and appropriate evidence so we're able to make a proper assessment and analyze this area of the audit and hopefully make good recommendations. We should document the audit process. How are we going to do this audit? Describe the audit work and evidence so that we are able to support our audit findings and conclusions. And we should identify and conclude on the various findings from the audit. So in all of this, when we do an audit, it's done in a way that seeks for quality of the audit through proper supervision, proper skills, gathering enough information to be able to make some audit assertions, and then, of course, document everything I did in a way that is backed up by that evidence I collected. We also have this term materiality. A material item is a weakness or absence of control that could pose a significant deficiency, or could be then a sign of a material weakness within a process. When we conduct an audit, we should always understand what is important and what isn't. The audit should, of course, identify what is significant or material. For example, a company might have a $100 million project, and we find that there's an error of a few $100s in that project accounting. Well, that's probably not material. That's not significant. That's within a rounding error, for example. Whereas if I'm looking at a $1,000 purchase and I find there's $100, the same amount of problem, $100 error in this, well, that is material because that's 10% of this. So we have to consider that materiality, what is significant, and that often requires a little bit of auditor judgment. But together with this, we also have to look at the cumulative effect. If I find this little problem plus that little problem plus another, does that add up to maybe, for example, a major problem? We, of course, should look for any time where there is an absence of or ineffective controls, or, for example, a significance the control is just not adequate, it's deficient, or a likelihood of a weakness resulting in a significant deficiency. Anytime we find these things, we must disclose them so that the organization is aware of this material potential weakness. Audits are done based on audit evidence. Audit evidence, quite often through, we say here, the collection of audit work papers, requires us to obtain sufficient and appropriate amounts of evidence so that we're able to draw a reasonable conclusion. When I looked at this process, I gathered enough information that I could make an assessment of the actual efficiency of that process. I didn't just look at one transaction, for example, which would not necessarily have given me a good, thorough understanding of that area. We must, as auditors, use that professional due care we talked about before to evaluate whether or not the evidence we have is sufficient to support the conclusions and to achieve the objective of the audit itself. Performance standards also looked at where I'm using the work of other experts. I should certainly consider using the work of other experts where that's appropriate, but when I bring in somebody else who's an expert, make sure they are truly an expert. Not just that they claim, but they actually don't have any qualifications in the area. I should always document any time I've used outside work in the report or, for example, the outside of the report as well. I should consider if I've used primarily outside work in order to support my audit findings. Is that adequate? Is it unbiased and complete in others to make my audit assumptions. And if it's not, maybe I need to repeat some of the tests or do additional tests to ensure that the work of that other expert also can be validated and I can put my name on it as having then approved that work. I should also address where there's a scope limitation, where the required evidence is not obtained. Maybe, for example, I was unable to get access to a certain system or a certain location. Then I would address that in the audit report saying, because we are unable to gain this access, the effect of our audit has been limited, that we cannot make any type of assumption about the process in that department, for example. One of the things that we should always do when we conduct an audit is be alert to the possibility of irregularity and illegal acts. When I am conducting an audit, I should consider the risk. Could someone be committing fraud? Could someone be circumventing the process? So we always need to be a little bit skeptical. In fact, I like the term it uses here on the very right there. Maintain an attitude of professional skepticism. And ISACA defines this as the way to ensure that when somebody says something or presents something to you, you sort of say, yeah, thank you, but you still want to verify it. You're not just going to accept it at face value. Consider, is it possible that there is something illegal or irregular in this process that I'm looking at? And a very good example of this was a fraud found in a bank, where a bank manager had committed a massive amount of fraud of writing loans to himself under fake names and so on. And the sad thing was that this was found eventually because one of the employees of the bank called up to security and said, there's something wrong here. And when it was looked at, it's found that 3 times the auditors who had audited that bank had actually had the fraudulent documents in their hand. But they had just accepted the explanation from the branch manager of what that was and didn't realize they were holding in their hands a documented fraud. That means we need to be that much more skeptical and not just accept an explanation, oh yeah, don't worry about it, it's fine. But we should, of course, document and communicate any material irregularities in a timely manner to appropriate parties, say, for example, to senior management. Then we have the reporting standards. The reporting standards say that we must communicate the results of our audit upon the completion of this audit engagement. Now, that, of course, goes according to that initial audit plan, where we said we identified who should get a copy of the audit, as well as it could be that there are certain restrictions on certain content or the circulation or distribution of the audit. Maybe the audit contains some very sensitive information, in some cases that might even lead up to something like, say, a fraud investigation. We can't just pass all this information to everybody. In the audit report, we detail the scope of the audit. We document what were the objectives we were trying to accomplish with this audit, when we conducted the audit, the period of coverage, the nature of the audit. Was it, for example, a compliance audit? And, of course, the timing and how much work was performed. In a very mature process, we might do less work than in something which is very new and requires a more in-depth review. We then document what did we find. Now, findings are facts. The finding is that it is exactly 73% of calls were answered within 2 minutes. That's the fact. But the actual conclusion would be the analysis of that fact. And this is where we as auditors have to be really careful that we don't mix together our audit conclusions and recommendations together with the fact. So we can say, when we reviewed the call center process, we found that 73% of the calls were answered within the 30 seconds specified as the goal in the documented procedure. That's the fact. But we should not say we found an unacceptable level of 73%, nor should we say we found an acceptable level. No, because that is our analysis, whether it's unacceptable or acceptable. The fact is that 73% were. So we list that actual fact, the finding, and later on, we could turn around and say, based on our audit finding that 73% of the calls were answered within the specified 30-second time, we find that to be an unacceptable level of service according to the standards promoted by the organization to answer all calls or 90% of all calls within 30 seconds. So then we can put in our conclusion and, of course, our recommendation about, do we change the number of staff? Do we change the policy? What is our recommendation? Sometimes we have to put in a qualification. We are unable to perform all the elements of this audit engagement due to a lack of cooperation from management to provide the necessary access to personnel or documentation. We could say the performance of this audit was limited because we could not get access to this building or access to this system. So those are something we will always document in the audit report as well. And then we sign the audit report, date it, and distribute it according to the rules of the engagement and, of course, the audit charter. It's important that when we report on the completion of an audit, that all findings are supported by the audit evidence or the audit work papers, and that the finding where we say 73% of calls were answered within 30 seconds, it should be backed up maybe not just by one review, but a review conducted over maybe several different days at different times. So sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. We also can report according to follow-up. Maybe, for example, we've given a recommendation that the organization make this change, and we can then follow up to see whether or not it was done. We monitor through gaining relevant information that will allow us to conclude whether management has actually done what they said they would do when we discussed with them our audit findings and recommendations. Have they done things in a timely way and appropriately? The key points. As auditors, we must follow all four of these standards. The areas of audit general standards, performance standards, reporting standards, as well as meeting the ethical requirements and standards and how we perform an audit. This, of course, provides assurance on whether or not the audit report that we present can be believable, credible, and is complete.